The ice had been solid under their boots for 4 hours. Then Frost stopped walking, and 6 seconds later, the entire shelf beneath them started to break apart. Navy SEAL Cole Bennett would later say the 6 seconds between his dog freezing mid-stride and the ice actually cracking were the longest of his career, because he'd learned, the hard way, exactly what it meant when Frost went still like that. The ice was breaking beneath them. His dog heard it seconds before it cracked. Who was Cole Bennett? Cole Bennett grew up on Kodiak Island, Alaska, in a family that had worked the water for 3 generations. Not fishing, though plenty of neighbors did, but rescue. His father, Marcus Bennett, spent 26 years with the Coast Guard, most of them running icebreaker support and cold water rescue operations in some of the most unforgiving water in the Northern Hemisphere. Marcus had a rule he drilled into Cole from the time he could walk on a dock without falling in. Ice never tells you it's about to break with your eyes. It tells you with sound, if you know how to listen. It took years of standing beside his father in the cold before Cole understood that this wasn't a metaphor Marcus was fond of. It was a literal, practical rule his father genuinely lived by, on every body of water and every stretch of ice he ever worked. A groan means it's settling. A sharp crack means it's already too late to be standing where you're standing. And silence, real silence, right before either one, means something underneath is shifting in a way you can't see yet. Cole spent his childhood learning to hear the difference the way other kids learn to read. His father would take him out onto frozen inlets in winter, not to test him exactly, just to make him listen, pointing out sounds Cole couldn't have named on his own, teaching him that ice wasn't silent, it was talking constantly, and the people who died on it were almost always the ones who hadn't learned its language. The Bennett family's connection to the water ran back further than Marcus. Cole's grandfather had crewed fishing boats out of the same harbor, and stories about ice and cold water and the specific ways both could turn on a person without warning were as much a part of family dinners growing up as anything else discussed at the table. Cole remembers, as a very young child, not fully understanding why his father sometimes went quiet for entire evenings after certain calls came in over the radio, only understanding much later that those silences were their own kind of language too, the sound of someone processing exactly how close something had come to going wrong on the water that day. There was a specific loss that shaped how seriously Marcus took all of this, one he only told Cole about once, the year Cole turned 16. A crewmate of his father's, early in Marcus's career, had gone through thin ice during a training exercise nobody expected to be dangerous. Marcus had heard the sound beforehand, the specific silence his own mentor had once tried to teach him to recognize, and hadn't trusted it enough to say anything. He carried that for the rest of his career, and it became the entire reason he refused to let his own son grow up not knowing how to listen. Marcus told Cole that night, sitting on the same dock they'd returned to years later after the ice shelf incident, that the worst part wasn't losing his crewmate. It was knowing, with absolute certainty afterward, that he'd actually heard the warning and simply hadn't trusted his own ears enough to act on it. He said trusting an instinct you can't fully explain is harder than it sounds, especially when acting on it means stopping an entire operation over a sound only you noticed. He made Cole promise, that night, that if he ever heard something nobody else could hear, he wouldn't make the same mistake his father had made once, and never forgiven himself for. Cole enlisted with that lesson already fused into how he moved through the world. Cold water and ice terrain became his specialty almost by default. Instructors noticed early that Cole Bennett didn't need instruments half the time to know when conditions were turning dangerous. He'd simply gone quiet, the way his father taught him to, and started listening. 5 years into his career, Cole was paired with a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois named Frost, whose training file noted an unusually acute auditory sensitivity, capable of detecting sounds at frequencies and distances well beyond standard working dog benchmarks, but prone to what his evaluators called unexplained freezing behavior in cold terrain exercises that had cost him 2 prior handler assignments. The dog named Frost. Every working dog handler learns to trust specific behavioral signals. Most of those signals are trained deliberately, drilled into a dog through months of repetition,
until the response becomes automatic. Frost's freezing behavior wasn't one of those. Nobody had trained it.
It simply appeared, unpredictably, in ice and snow environments. And 2 handlers before Cole had treated it as a liability serious enough to request reassignment. The training reports from Frost's first 2 handlers described the behavior almost identically, using words like unpredictable and operationally disruptive. One report noted an incident during a routine cold weather exercise where Frost froze completely for nearly a full minute with no apparent trigger, delaying the team's movement long enough that the exercise had to be restarted. The handler's conclusion was that Frost was unsuited for high-tempo cold terrain operations. Nobody on that evaluation team had thought to ask what, specifically, Frost might have been listening to in that minute of stillness. Cole read Frost's file the same week. He read about his father's lost crewmate, and something about the pattern struck him immediately. Frost wasn't malfunctioning. He was doing, with his ears, what Marcus Bennett had spent a career training himself to do with the same sense, detecting subtle acoustic shifts in ice and snow that indicated structural instability long before it became visible. Where 2 previous handlers saw an unreliable dog, Cole saw an animal who had, somehow, developed the exact skill his father had spent 30 years trying to teach human ears to recognize. If this story is already hitting you the way stories about Cole and his father hit me every time I write one, go ahead and drop a like right now. It genuinely helps a channel this size get in front of more people. And this one only gets more intense from here.
Cole and Frost trained together for 3 years before the deployment that would test everything. In that time, Cole developed a rule of his own, one his father would have recognized immediately. Whenever Frost went still, completely still, mid-stride, on ice or snow, Cole stopped everyone around him instantly. No questions, no hesitation, no second-guessing. It had cost the team time on exercises more than once. Cole never once regretted the rule. There was a training exercise roughly a year into their partnership that convinced the rest of Cole's unit the rule was worth keeping.
During a routine cold weather movement across a frozen training lake, Frost froze exactly the way his file described. Cole halted the entire team without explanation, over the visible frustration of 2 other operators who saw no evidence of any problem. 20 minutes later, a section of ice nearly identical to where they'd been standing gave way beneath a support vehicle attempting to cross the same lake from a different approach. Nobody on Cole's team ever questioned the rule again. Operation Northern Watch begins. The mission was a joint reconnaissance operation across a section of Arctic ice shelf, monitoring activity near a disputed research station roughly 6 kilometers from the nearest stable coastline. Ice shelf operations carry a specific, well-documented danger. Shelves that appear solid on satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar can develop stress fractures invisible to both, especially in the hours following a temperature shift, when ice that held weight easily the day before can fail without warning. The team had trained specifically for this kind of terrain for months leading up to deployment, running drills on similar shelf conditions in a controlled environment, learning to read the subtle visual cues that separated stable ice from compromised sections. Cole had gone through the same training as everyone else, but he'd also brought something none of his teammates had. 3 years of watching Frost's ears do a version of the same job, faster and more reliably than any instrument the team carried. Cole's team had been briefed on the ice conditions, cleared by 2 separate assessments, and moving across the shelf for just over 4 hours when Frost, walking his usual position slightly ahead of Cole, stopped. He didn't sit. He didn't whine. He simply stood completely rigid, ears locked forward, and refused to take another step. The rest of the team, unaware yet of what the stillness meant, continued moving for a few more strides before Cole's halt command reached them. In the 2 or 3 seconds before everyone fully processed the stop, Cole would later say, was the first moment he genuinely understood what his father must have felt on that frozen inlet decades earlier. The specific, isolating certainty of hearing, or in this case seeing, a warning that nobody else around you has registered yet. The crack. Cole didn't hesitate. 3 years of the rule he made for himself took over before conscious thought caught up, and he called the halt to the rest of the team. In the same breath, he crouched down beside Frost, listening for whatever his dog had heard 6 seconds before he could hear it himself. Those 6 seconds felt, Cole would say later, both impossibly long and nowhere near long enough. He ran through his father's lessons almost involuntarily. Groan means settling. Crack means too late. Silence means something shifting, while straining to hear anything at all beneath the wind noise and the sound of his own team's breathing. For most of that 6 seconds, there was nothing. Just Frost, rigid, ears forward, and Cole crouched beside him, trusting an instinct he still couldn't fully explain, exactly the way his father had once failed to trust his own. The sound arrived like his father had once described it to him on a frozen inlet in Kodiak, a lifetime ago. Not a crack yet, but a groan, low and resonant, traveling through the ice itself rather than through the air. And then, unmistakably, the crack. A visible line split across the surface, roughly 15 meters ahead of where Frost had stopped, spreading fast, branching in 3 directions at once. If you want to see how Cole and Frost get out of what happens next, hit subscribe now. This channel is built around true-to-life stories exactly like this one, and I promise you this is about to get a lot more intense. The entire section of shelf the team had been walking toward began to separate from the stable ice behind them, a fracture line opening wide enough, in the span of maybe 20 seconds, to become a gap neither Cole nor anyone else on his team could simply step across. The 2 operators who had continued walking before the halt reached them were now stranded on the wrong side of the widening crack, close enough to communicate but suddenly separated by open water and shifting ice that neither team could safely cross toward the other. The collapse. Cole made the call that every operator training on ice terrain is taught to make and hopes never to actually need. Retreat, fast, along the exact line Frost had already started moving toward. Not the shortest path back to stable ice, but the path Frost's ears had apparently already determined was the safest one available. They ran. Behind them, the fracture accelerated, ice slabs the size of vehicles beginning to separate and tilt, dark water visible in the widening gaps between them. Frost stayed just ahead of Cole the entire retreat, occasionally veering left or right in ways that made no visual sense given the terrain in front of them. Until, twice, Cole understood only in hindsight that Frost had been avoiding sections of ice that looked identical to the stable path but apparently sounded different beneath his paws. The 2 operators cut off on the far side of the initial crack were forced onto a different retreat line entirely, working their way toward a section of shelf that satellite data suggested remained connected to the mainland ice further west. Cole could hear them over the radio, their voices tight with the same controlled urgency he recognized in his own. And for the better part of 2 minutes neither team knew for certain whether the other would make it to stable ground before the shelf finished coming apart beneath all of them. The final gap, roughly 4 meters wide by the time Cole and Frost reached it, required a jump neither of them had trained for on this specific kind of unstable terrain. Frost went first, clearing it with room to spare. Cole followed a half-second behind, landing hard on stable ice just as the section he jumped from tilted and slid into the water behind him, taking nearly 30 meters of shelf with it in a violent collapse that sent spray and ice fragments into the air around both of them. They lay there for a moment, Cole's hand still gripping Frost's harness, both of them breathing hard, staring back at a gap in the ice shelf where solid ground had been standing less than a minute earlier. It took another 11 minutes before the second team radioed that they'd reached stable ice as well, all 4 operators and Frost accounted for, the mission scrubbed, the entire shelf behind them now a field of broken, shifting fragments where a research station's approach route had existed that morning. Coming home to Kodiak. Cole took leave 3 weeks later and flew home to Kodiak, sitting with his father on the same dock where Marcus had once taught a small boy to listen to ice instead of just look at it. He told him everything. The 6 seconds, the sound, the crack, the jump, the 30 meters of shelf that dropped into open water behind them. Marcus listened the way he always had, quiet, weathered, staring out at the same cold water that had shaped nearly every important lesson he ever given his son. Cole noticed,
partway through the story, that his father's hands had gone still on the railing in front of him, gripping it slightly tighter than seemed necessary for a man just sitting and listening. When Cole finished, Marcus didn't say much at first. He looked out at the water for a long moment, the way Cole remembered him doing the one time he talked about the crewmate he lost decades earlier.
The silence stretched long enough that Cole started to wonder if he'd said something wrong, or triggered a memory his father would rather not have revisited. "That sound I told you about," Marcus said finally. "The one before the crack. I heard it once and didn't trust it enough to say anything." He paused, still looking out at the water rather than at his son. "Sounds like your dog trusted it enough for both of you." Cole asked him, carefully, whether it helped at all, knowing that the lesson had made it to someone, even if it arrived through a dog rather than through Marcus's own warning decades earlier. His father thought about it for a long time before answering, longer than Cole expected for what seemed like a simple question. Eventually he said that he'd spent 30 years wondering whether the lesson he tried to teach every rescue swimmer he trained had actually saved anyone, or whether it just lived in his own head, as a rule he followed without ever really knowing if it worked. Hearing that it had worked, even once, even secondhand through a dog he'd never met, was worth more to him than Cole probably understood. Frost recovered fully from the exertion of that day, and by every account he's still Cole's primary partner, still doing the exact thing that got him passed over by 2 other handlers before Cole ever read his file. Before any cold terrain operation now, Cole crouches down, rests a hand against Frost's chest, and says nothing at all, just watches his ears, and trusts them completely. It's a small ritual, barely visible to anyone who doesn't know to look for it, but Cole says it's the closest thing he has to his father's old habit of standing on a dock in silence, just listening, before deciding whether it was safe to go out. Marcus asked to meet Frost before Cole flew back for his next deployment. He spent nearly 20 minutes with him on that same dock, mostly in silence, occasionally resting a hand on his head the way he used to rest a hand on Cole's shoulder during their winter lessons on the ice. It wasn't a dramatic reunion, or an emotional scene either of them talked about much afterward. Just a retired rescue swimmer and a working dog sitting quietly together, each of them, in their own way, fluent in a language most people never learn to hear. Before Cole left, Marcus told him one more thing, quieter than everything else he'd said that visit. That some lessons only really finished the job once they've been passed all the way down, however many steps it takes, and however strange the shape they arrive in. Which moment stuck with you most out of everything in this story? The 6 seconds of silence, the crack itself, or Marcus on the dock at the end? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, and I mean that. There's a particular kind of trust that takes years to build and about 6 seconds to fully justify. Cole Bennett grew up learning that ice speaks, if you know how to listen. What he learned on that shelf is that some ears hear it faster, and more clearly than any human training ever could. And that trusting those ears completely, without hesitation, without needing to understand exactly how they work, is sometimes the only thing standing between a person and the exact fate his father spent a whole career trying to prevent for someone else. Marcus Bennett spent 30 years teaching people to listen to water and ice. He never got the chance to save the one crewmate whose silence he didn't trust in time. What he didn't know, until his son sat down on that same dock decades later, was that the lesson had already been passed on, and it had already worked. Carried the final distance not by a person who'd learned to listen the way Marcus taught, but by a dog who'd simply always known how. It's worth sitting with how strange that inheritance actually is, when you look at it closely. Marcus never met Frost until after the ice shelf incident. He never trained him, never worked with him, never had any direct hand in whatever it was that let Frost hear a stress fracture forming in ice from meters away. And yet the lesson made it there anyway, not through instruction, but through Cole, who absorbed his father's way of listening so completely that he recognized the same instinct the moment he saw it in a dog nobody else wanted. That's the part of this story that stays with Cole the most, even now. Not the 6 seconds, not the jump, not the 30 meters of shelf collapsing behind them. It's the quiet certainty
that whatever his father spent 30 years trying to teach the people around him, some version of it found its way through anyway, patient, persistent, arriving decades late and in a shape nobody could have predicted, exactly when it was needed most. Maybe that's the part worth remembering longest. Not every lesson gets delivered the way you plan it.
Some of them wait, quietly, for years or even decades, for exactly the right pair of ears to carry them the rest of the way. And there's no way to know in advance whose ears those will be, or when the moment will finally arrive that proves the waiting was worth it. If you want more true-to-life stories like Cole and Frost's, hit subscribe. New stories go up regularly, and every single one is built the same way this one was. Real stakes, real instinct, and a bond that gets tested in exactly the moment it matters most.